Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kiran, and my presentation is entitled Covering Turbans and Beards, Title VII's Role in Legitimizing Religious Discrimination Against Sikhs. So before we start, I wanted to just get an idea of how many people in this room are familiar with at least some of the names on this list. You might have heard about them in the news, read about them. Can I see a show of hands? Okay, good. It looks like almost everyone. So the thing that all of these people have in common is that they've all been discriminated against in the workplace because of their religion, and specifically because of their appearance. And this is definitely a huge issue for us today, because as these EEOC statistics show that in 2000, only about 2,000 religious-based charges were received by the EEOC, and that's more than doubled in 2011. So this is definitely a huge issue for our generation to deal with discrimination in the workplace. So one of the things that Sikhs do when they are discriminated against in the workplace is bring a lawsuit under Title VII, which is supposed to protect our rights in the workplace. However, I argue that Title VII doesn't necessarily provide the protection that we think it's supposed to. And so what I'm going to talk about here is Title VII and two different doctrines under Title VII, religious accommodation and grooming codes. And these are the two doctrines that most affect Sikhs. And so I'll talk a little bit more about these later. And then I'm going to talk about a specific case in which a Sikh man applied to be a manager at a restaurant and kind of the ordeal that he went through with that. And I'm going to look at these cases and the case law with these two recurring themes, the trivialization of religion and enforced covering. So before I get into the case law, I want to talk a little bit about the trivialization of religion. This is a trend in our society that we see towards treating religious beliefs as arbitrary and unimportant. And this is supported by the rhetoric that implies that there's something wrong with religious devotion. So you can see this with a person of any religion. You can see this with Christians if they're overly devout. But you see it a lot with people who are non-Christian because they're so different. And any display of religious belief is just seen as, it's just trivialized. It's seen as not being important. So Title VII says that basically it's illegal for an employer to discriminate against an employee based on a couple of different statuses, which cover race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And I'm going to be focusing just on religion. And the thing about religion is that it's a little bit different than the other statuses because it has added protection. With race and sex and national origin, you're only protected in terms of it's viewed as an immutable characteristic. So you're only protected in terms that nobody can discriminate against you for being a woman or for being African American. But with religion, you have that, and then you also have this added protection where if you need some sort of accommodation to practice your religion or to observe it in the workplace, an employer is supposed to make an effort to accommodate you. And so the statute actually says that an employer should make an effort to reasonably accommodate you unless it would cause the employer undue hardship. And at first glance, this seems like really great. Religion gets us extra added protection, but in reality, this protection is really weak. And so what I argue is that because it's so weak, it actually legitimizes the discrimination that religious minorities such as Sikhs face. So today, in my paper, I talk about both of the prongs, but today I'm just going to be focusing on the undue hardship prong. And the seminal case on undue hardship is TWA v. Hardison. And in this case, the plaintiff, Hardison, was employed by TWA as a clerk. And he worked there for a couple of years, and at some point he joined a religion that required that he observe the Sabbath and not work on Saturdays. And at first this was fine, but the thing was that TWA had a collective bargaining agreement, which is a contract between a union and an employer, and it sets up the terms and conditions of employment. And that said that when employees are choosing the shifts that they want to work on, there's a seniority system. So at first it was fine because Hardison had enough seniority to choose whatever shifts he wanted, but at some point he transferred to a different building and he lost that seniority. And after he transferred, he was asked to cover the shift of a coworker on Saturdays, which he obviously couldn't do. So he told his employer that, I can't do this because it goes against my religious beliefs. And he even offered to reduce his work to just 4 days a week so that, maybe they could have someone else come in and do the work instead. However, TWA rejected this, and they made two arguments. First, they said Hardison's job was essential, and he's the only person on the shift who could perform it. And second of all, if they let him not work on Saturdays, TWA would have to either move an employee from a different department or manager or employee from a different department to do the job or pay someone overtime, and they weren't willing to do that. And so he was subsequently terminated for insubordination. This case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the employer. And what the Supreme Court basically said is that both of these alternatives, either moving someone from another department to do his job or paying someone overtime, would involve costs to TWA, either in the form of lost efficiency in other jobs or of higher wages. And the reason this case is so important is because it goes on to say that to require TWA to bear more than a de minimis cost would be an undue hardship. So now we finally know what undue hardship means. It means anything that's more than a de minimis cost. Okay, there we have it. And at first it seems like, okay, we don't want to overburden employers, this might be fine, but there's a couple of problems with the Supreme Court's rationale in this case. First of all, the Supreme Court just took what the trial court said at face value. The trial court said this would be an undue hardship for TWA, and the Supreme Court just kind of adopted that opinion without looking for any support. And TWA didn't show any evidence of what efficiency it would have lost if another employee or supervisor from another department had to come and work in Hardison's place. So there wasn't really any evidence talking about lost efficiency. And as we found out later, the actual cost of accommodating Hardison and letting him take Saturdays off and paying someone else to work overtime would have only been $150 for the 3 months that they needed someone to cover that shift. So basically what that means is that if an employer has to pay more than $150 to accommodate a religious employee, then the employer doesn't have to do that. And that's kind of oversimplifying it, but that's what we get out of this case. So like I mentioned, this is a Supreme Court case, and so it's really important because all other courts are bound by what the Supreme Court said. And so this provision is kind of at the heart of all religious accommodation cases. And as you can see, that protection has been significantly weakened because the standard is so easy for employers to meet when you bring a lawsuit under Title VII for religious discrimination. And so because of that, this provision kind of ends up acting like a vehicle for employers to justify not accommodating religious employees. And by doing that, courts are legitimizing the discrimination that our employers are engaging in. And then what happens is, unfortunately, religious minorities like Sikhs are forced to choose between religion and employment, which is the whole point of this provision in the first place, is to not make employees have to make this choice. So the second doctrine that Sikhs have to deal with a lot is the grooming codes and dress codes doctrine. And this doctrine developed through different race and sex cases, so I'll talk about that. But I just wanted to mention briefly that a lot of employers have some sort of dress or grooming codes because and they'll cite business reasons for it, like it boosts morality or it increases productivity. So those are the reasons that employers give for having dress and grooming codes. And examples of that can include having all employees wear a uniform or requiring that men be clean shaven. And there's even a case that said it's okay to require women to wear makeup on the job. So all of that was okay. And these three cases here are kind of representative of how the courts deal with these dress and grooming codes. So in Willingham, the plaintiff brought a lawsuit against his employer saying that he was being discriminated against because he had long hair and the employer wouldn't hire him, and that the grooming code said that men couldn't have long hair whereas women could. And he's saying, okay, I'm being discriminated against based on sex. And the court said, no, you're not, because you can cut your hair. And if you don't want to cut it, then fine, you don't get the job. Similarly, in Lanigan, the plaintiff was a woman, and she was terminated for wearing a pantsuit. And keep in mind, this case is from 1979. She was terminated for wearing a pantsuit in the executive suites, which was against the company's dress code. Women were not allowed to wear pants in that department. And she brought a lawsuit based on that. And again, the court basically just said, you don't have to wear pants. And if you don't want to, that's fine. The employer has the authority fire you for that, and so she lost as well. And then in Rogers, the plaintiff was an African-American woman, and American Airlines had a policy that prohibited braided hairstyles in certain departments, and she worked in that department, and she wore her hair in cornrows. And so she brought a lawsuit saying that she was being discriminated against based on race. And once again, the court ruled against her, stating that her hairstyle was an easily changed characteristic, and if she didn't want to change it, then she couldn't argue about the fact that she didn't have a job. So what are all of these cases really talking about? All of these cases are really about enforced covering. And covering is a concept that was developed by a theory that was brought up by a sociologist. And this is a process by which individuals downplay certain identity traits to conform to dominant cultural norms. So Goffman stated that these identity traits are kind of like stigmas. And these stigmas can be anything from race, disability, social class, age, religion, all of these things. And dominant cultural norms, as articulated here by Professor Yoshino, are white, male, ostensibly straight, Protestant, able-bodied standards. So covering is about the obtrusiveness of your stigma. You have this identity trait, and you're being forced to conform to these norms. And everybody covers. We all do it in our daily lives. Sometimes we might do it without even realizing that we're doing it. But when it really becomes problematic is in the workplace, when you don't want to cover, but your employer is forcing you to cover. And the prime example of that, again, is Sikhs. When these lawsuits come up, it's because a Sikh man or even a woman is refusing to cover and enforce to these cultural norms by shaving or removing their turban. And so, that's really problematic. And the reason this is problematic is because covering is a form of assimilation. This employer is trying to force you to assimilate to society, and that in and of itself is it's a form of discrimination because you're being forced to be something that you're not. Unfortunately, as you've seen with the grooming and dress codes case law, this isn't a form of discrimination that you're protected against. So again, with all of these three cases, the court is saying to the plaintiff in the first one, you can't expect to have long hair and violate this policy and have a job because you're refusing to cover it and conform to our image of what a man should look like. And if you refuse to cover it, then forget it. You don't have a right to a job. Similarly, in the second one, the court is basically saying, if you're refusing to cover it and conform to our norm of what we think a woman should look like and what she should dress like, then fine, forget it. You don't have to do that, but you can't expect to have a job. And then the same thing with Rogers. The court mentioned that her hairstyle was an easily changed characteristic. If she doesn't want to conform to our image of what whiteness is, then fine. She doesn't have to, but she can't come to court and expect to get some sort of remedy for it. So and all of this sounds really harsh, but the way the courts justify these outcomes is by differentiating between mutable characteristics and immutable characteristics. So mutable characteristics are things like the length of your hair, the way you dress, things like that, and those are not protected. You're not protected, even if it's so closely connected to a protected status like race or sex. Like with Rogers, her hairstyle is very closely related to her race, but her hairstyle's not protected. And then immutable characteristics are things like sex and race, which are protected. So the courts justify these outcomes by making that distinction. And the key thing to remember is that with religion, both of those things are technically protected under Title VII because religion is that special status that has the extra protection. So technically with religion, you're supposed to have the fact that you belong to a religion protected and the fact that you are, maybe dressing in a way or acting in a way that goes hand in hand with your religious beliefs. Unfortunately, even though religion is supposed to have that extra protection, courts still tend to slip back into that mentality of mutable and immutable and kind of place it onto religious discrimination cases. So in this case, EEOC v. Samuels of Georgia, and also keep in mind that this is from 1981, so maybe a case from today wouldn't have rhetoric that's quite as harsh, but I'm sure that it's still there in terms of unconscious bias. So in this case, Mohan Singh Tucker applied for a job at a restaurant as a restaurant manager at Sambo's restaurant in Georgia. And when he went to turn in his application, he was told that if he was accepted as a trainee, he would have to shave his beard because that was the company's grooming policy. If you worked in the restaurant, you had to be clean shaven. Tucker told him that he couldn't comply because of religion, and so he wasn't hired. And what he did was, he brought this lawsuit. And the court found, as we've been seeing a trend, the court found for the employer. And what the court said is that Sambos couldn't have accommodated Tucker without incurring undue hardship. They couldn't hire him without incurring this undue hardship. And the way they justified this was by saying that if they let Tucker be exempt from the grooming policy and be clean shaven and let him keep his beard, this is just one of the reasons. I talk about other reasons in my paper, but they talk about the effect this would have on Sambo's public image and how this would offend certain customers and how it would diminish the clean-cut image of Sambo's restaurant. And then also, remember how I mentioned in Hardison how in that case, the TWA only would have had to pay $150 to have someone cover the shift. Here, the court kind of stuck on to that and used us as a benchmark, saying like $150 is an undue hardship. And they kind of just jumped onto that and said that it would have been an undue hardship here for Sambos to accommodate the plaintiff. And the things that the court said to justify this ruling are really troubling. So the court said, Sambos didn't allow managers to wear beards, long mustaches, or headwear because these don't comply with the public image that Sambos has built up over the years. They also said that the types of grooming codes that are common in this industry are based on management's perception and experience, and that the consuming public prefers to go to restaurants where the managers or the employees are clean shaven, and that this fact is based on years of experience in the restaurant business. The court went on to say that clean shavenness is essential to attracting and holding customers in the market, and that adverse reactions to beards can be attributed to customers' simple aversion to or discomfort in dealing with bearded people, the concern that beards are unsanitary or conducive to unsanitary conditions, and the concern that a restaurant operated by a bearded manager might be lax in maintaining standards as to cleanliness and hygiene in other regards. So I'm sure a lot of you guys are troubled by what the court is saying here, and it is problematic. And it goes back to the Hardison case, right, which set the standard. And with the Hardison case, the court was very much trivializing religion. The court is saying that it's fine, even though the employer had these options to put these accommodations into place, the employer doesn't have to do it, even though it would only have cost the employer $150. And so we kind of see that theme here again. What the court here is doing is that they're according customer preference more important than Tucker's religious beliefs, and by doing this, they're legitimizing the discrimination that Sambos was engaging in against Tucker. And again, like I mentioned, they use the $150 benchmark. Furthermore, the evidence that they use is management's perception and experience, which again, it's like, where is this coming from? There's no qualitative data. It's just these people who are working there are saying this. And then again, here are just kind of the things that they talked about. Customer preference. It's not, none of this, first of all, it's discriminatory and it's stereotypical, and it's troubling that the court is using this to legitimize their decision, but there's no qualitative data. What the court is basically doing here is just using stereotypes. And the court's also engaging in enforced covering. The court gave significant weight to the restaurant industry norms, and they made Tucker's employment contingent on his a willingness to cover and conform, and he wasn't willing to cover and conform, so that means he doesn't have a right to employment. And this is just like the grooming codes cases that we talked about. And the difference is that there, the courts were able to justify it based on mutable and immutable traits. Here, the court doesn't even touch on that. It just glosses over it. Okay, so basically, in conclusion, what I came up with at the end of this paper is that so the religious accommodation provision, the precedent there trivializes religion, and because of that, the courts created a standard that's really easy for employers to meet, and it allows employers to avoid accommodating religious employees. Then with the grooming codes doctrine, the courts validate employers' enforced covering, and this further weakens the provision, and this is especially problematic for groups like Sikhs, for whom, when they bring a lawsuit, both of these doctrines would apply. And so the result here is that rather than protecting the rights of religious employees, Title VII is legitimizing the very discrimination that it's meant to protect against, and it's giving employers an easy way to navigate the legal process in their favor. And so religious employees, again, are forced to choose between their religion and employment. In terms of what's next, my paper was only about just pointing out this problem and bringing it to people's attention. And so I would just say that what's next is like, we need to figure out what's next. Do we need stronger legislation? What do we need to do? So yeah, that's it.